I think I remember very well Ian Gow and Sir Anthony Berry being killed, Joe Cox, and more recently David Amesh. And the Prime Minister is quite right to highlight the dangers of being a public figure, of being a politician in Westminster. And he's quite right to call on people across the country to be more moderate in their language, and I think it's a veiled call also to people like Suella Braverman, Lee Anderson, Liz Truss, and the people who whip up a storm on private television channels. It's good to promote debate. It's good to have informed and clear views. But I think people who are in public life have a duty to do their homework, have a duty to work out exactly what words mean and when words have changed their meaning and whether or not they are leading that change in the change of meaning. And particularly, I think it's important and incumbent on politicians to protect people of their side and the other sides. And so, therefore, I think both Suella Braverman and Lee Anderson are particularly at fault for the comments that they made about Islamist and Islamism. I think fundamentally, as Sadiq Khan says, Mr. Anderson's comments were Islamophobic, anti-Muslim, and racist. And he's quite right to ask why there is a deafening silence from the cabinet and from him about the subject. I think simply to strip Anderson of the Conservative whip is not enough, and the fact that he cannot sit as a Conservative MP doesn't mean he can't rapidly join Reform. I'm sure that's where his heart lies, and not that there's anything specifically wrong with Reform. I don't see Reform as a concept to be a bad thing. I like the engagement of other parties and with other ideas. But again, Reform needs to watch its language and to, in the process of stimulating debate, it should not be stimulating prejudice and bigotry. And I think Suella Braverman is responsible for a lot of the problem. Suella Braverman and Priti Patel, frankly. And their idea that in order to hang on to power, they should distract by pointing to the relatively small number of migrants who are in the country. And this has now got to the point where migration now becomes a big issue because it's basically the only thing the Conservatives feel that they're in a position to talk about. And we're now at a point of cutting off our toes in order to squeeze into Cinderella's slipper. It's not ours, and we're going to destroy our extraordinarily good education system by barring people from coming here to study. And we're also seriously damaging our own National Health Service by making it harder and harder and harder for care workers to come over here. Basically, unless we treat somebody like a slave, we don't want them. I don't think that's a way. I don't think that's a way to be treating a worker in the 21st century. I don't think it's the way to be treating the worker in the 20th century or the 19th century. But we are going backwards. We are advancing backwards to a point where we are going to be standing still. And this is a time when, we're supposed to be gearing up to celebrating Stephenson's rocket and the development of the steam train. Well, the railways are grinding to an inevitable halt as well. The idea that Lee Anderson has put forward that legitimate protests have been hijacked by extremists, I think is untrue. There may be the occasional extremist, but a lot of the slogans reflect the a sort of unfocused, sloganized thinking which has been projected from Westminster, and so Westminster should not be surprised that this is what the public hands back. I think there's a lot to be said for stopping the conflict in Gaza. I think there's a lot to be said for stopping the conflict in Ukraine. But on what terms? And both conflicts need to be stopped in such a way that peace is the eventual result. And a ceasefire on terms that are not going to be acceptable either to Israel or Gaza is simply a pause before an even greater series of hostilities. The same sort of thing is true in Ukraine. The armistice at the end of the First World War was effectively a ceasefire or a pause. It was not peace. And a monster like Hitler was able to exploit that hole, which was clearly defined by John Maynard Keynes in The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Clearly defined. That book is like it's like reading a fortune teller's handbook. It's quite an extraordinary book, and certainly the first 50 or 60 odd pages are riveting, and then it gets into economics and it becomes a little bit more of a struggle, but it's a very good analysis, and we shouldn't be wishing that on anybody just simply so that it solves our conscience, salves our conscience. And there is a point also where you say, so, now is the point where you've got to have peace, Israel. Now is the point where you've got to have peace, Ukraine. Are you saying that there's a certain number of people who are permitted to die before you say, that's enough, now you have to stop? That's absurd. Any death is unacceptable. Any war is unacceptable. So once you cross that line, the only solution that is possible is a lasting peace. And the world should be coming together to enable that peace, not to force people to a negotiating table so that they can be made, so that the rest of the world can be made to feel comfortable again. The rest of the world needs to make sure the conditions are right so that peace can be effective, and we should have been doing that from day one of the Ukraine war. We should have been doing that from day one of the Gaza conflict. And we haven't. And we haven't because it seems more important for Western powers to run around and pick sides and pick pick an issue to support. It's important to know which side is right, and I think in both cases there is a good deal of moral consideration. In the case of Ukraine, it is absolutely and fundamentally clear that Ukraine is wrong. In the case of Israel, it's fundamentally clear that Hamas attacked Israel in a diabolic and horrific way. In the case of Israel, the thing gets slightly more muddied by Netanyahu's desire and plan to go for a ground offensive, which, number one, is not likely to be effective, and number two, the punitive cost effectively takes it out of the realms of a just war in every possible way. A just war is a war which is fought in a way where the one side responds to the other side in a measured way, and the firepower of Israel far surpasses the firepower of Gaza, and the majority of victims are civilians. And And equally, there isn't a possibility of a clear objective or a clear end to that war. There is in Ukraine. Ukraine is a defensive war. Ukraine is defending its own territory. That falls very firmly under the principles of the just war. What I find so interesting about the Ukrainian-Russian situation is that it was only recently that Patriarch Kirill embraced the theories of the just war, which for the most part are not part of the Russian Orthodox and Orthodox world view. But Kirill chose to make them so, and Putin has squashed every principle in the just war theory. Every single principle. He has disdain for the lot. Whatever we say, Putin is not a good man. But I'm afraid I would also say neither is Netanyahu. But neither are the Hamas terrorists.